So far, we discussed things on a fairly high level. It is time to get into much more detail, and we will start by taking a long look at living cells, which are at the basis of all life. This is only an introduction lesson, and we will discuss the cell structure in much more detail in the second chapter of the biology course. Let us start with the unified cell theory. In the late 1830s, botanist Matthias Schleiden and zoologist Theodor Schwann were studying tissues and proposed the unified cell theory. They came up with 3 claims about living cells that go as follows. 1. All organisms are composed of cells. 2. Cells are the basic units of structure and function in organisms. And 3. Cells come only from pre-existing cells, when cells themselves reproduce. As it turned out, they were right about their assumptions, as was demonstrated and tested many times over the following decades. Of course, not all cells are alike. Even in a single organism, such as the human body, there are many types of cells that make up different organ systems. For example, brain cells look and function quite differently from heart cells or blood cells. However, even though these cells look different and function differently, all cells share several basic properties. And note, this is not limited to human cells. This applies to all cells, in all living things. 1. Every cell is bounded by a selective barrier, called the plasma membrane, also referred to as the cell membrane. Think of it as the cell's skin, separating the inside from the outside. The word selective barrier means that some molecules and ions can pass through this barrier, moving to the inside or the outside of the cell, while others cannot. 2. The cytoplasm is the name given to everything that is inside the cell membrane. In the cytoplasm, we find 2 things, organelles, which are different subcellular parts, responsible for various functions of the cell. We will learn about them in future lessons. And in addition to organelles, we find the cytosol, which is a type of semi-liquid substance, like a jelly, consisting of an aqueous solution in which many molecules and ions are dissolved. The cytosol actually makes up most of the cell's volume, and is important in maintaining the cell's proper composition. 3. All cells contain genetic material in the form of chromosomes. The chromosomes consist mainly of DNA, which is a huge molecule that contains instructions on how to build the various proteins that make up our body. DNA is what is passed on through genetic inheritance, between parents and children, so of course it is a very important component of the cell. In addition to DNA, chromosomes contain many proteins, whose functions are mainly to protect, organize, and support the DNA. Different organisms have different numbers of chromosomes in their cells. For example, bacteria have 1 chromosome in each cell, humans have 46 chromosomes in each cell, and dogs have 78. All of this will become clearer as we continue with the course. 4. All cells have ribosomes, which are structures that synthesize or produce proteins, according to instructions found in the DNA. Pay attention to the verb synthesize, it means to create, to assemble. And finally 5. All cells are very small. They are so small that we cannot see them without a microscope. And this is also true for cells of very large organisms, such as elephants or whales. The reason cells are very small is that it creates a high ratio between the surface area of the cell and its volume. This is a simple geometric fact. The smaller objects are, the greater the ratio between their surface area and their volume. We don't need to understand the geometry, but it is very important to remember this reason. Small cells result in a high ratio between the surface area of the cell membrane and the volume of the cell. And why is this important? Because it allows the efficient flow of molecules and ions into and out of the cell. For example, Food substances can enter the cell, and waste materials can exit it. Without an efficient transfer of materials, the cell will simply die. Therefore, all cells, in all living creatures, are very small. And now for a very important part of the lecture. We can divide all living cells into two main types, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. In the diagram, a eukaryotic cell is drawn on the left, and a prokaryotic cell on the right. What is most noticeable? The eukaryotic cell, on the left, looks much more complex. It has many different organelles, like for example the mitochondria we see here, or the large cell nucleus we see here. In contrast, in the prokaryotic cell on the right, you don't see many organelles inside the cell. You see the large DNA molecule here in the center, and many small ribosomes. But overall, the cell looks simpler. So what are the main differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells? Look at the table. The most important difference is that in prokaryotic cells, there are no organelles surrounded by a membrane. As we've previously explained, every cell, of either type, is surrounded by the plasma membrane. But some organelles inside the cell may also be surrounded by a membrane, some even by two membranes. In prokaryotic cells, we will never find a membrane-bound organelle inside the cell. It is not that there are no organelles inside prokaryotic cells, they are simply much smaller, and are not surrounded by a membrane. On the other hand, in eukaryotic cells, there are many organelles inside the cell that are surrounded by a membrane, such as the cell nucleus. Note that prokaryotic cells do not have a cell nucleus at all. In the next slide, we will discuss the cell nucleus, which is the largest organelle found in the eukaryotic cell. The next difference is related to the domains in which the different cell types can be found. You probably remember the last lesson on taxonomy, where we discussed the three domains of life. And while we didn't go into details, there was a little note about the eukarya domain that said it was the domain of nucleated cells. Indeed, organisms in the eukarya domain are comprised of eukaryotic cells that contain a nucleus. Whereas the other two domains, bacteria and archaea, contain unicellular organisms comprised of prokaryotic cells, which do not have a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells are evolutionarily older than eukaryotic cells. In fact, fossil evidence indicates that the eukaryotic organisms, the eukaryotes, actually evolved from prokaryotes, somewhere between 1.5 to 2 billion years ago. They all evolved from a common ancestor, and at some point, the eukaryotic cells split, starting an entirely new phase of evolution. For this reason, we see differences in complexity and size between the two cell types. Eukaryotic cells are larger and more complex. They're still pretty small, and we've explained why. Even the largest of them, with a diameter of 100 micrometers, is still smaller than the size of a hair, and most of them are much smaller. But still, eukaryotic cells are on average 10 times larger than prokaryotic cells. In the next row, you can see the types of organisms that evolved based on each cell type. Most eukaryotic organisms are multicellular, meaning are composed of multiple cells. In contrast, with prokaryotic cells, very few organisms were able to develop beyond the unicellular level, meaning prokaryotes are single-cell organisms. There is also a difference in the way the genetic material is stored in the cells. We mentioned earlier that in every cell there is genetic material in the form of chromosomes, consisting of DNA and proteins. In prokaryotic cells, there is always a single chromosome with a circular shape, that is, one long DNA molecule closed in on itself. This molecule is found in an area of the cell called the nucleoid. In contrast, eukaryotic cells always contain more than one chromosome, with each chromosome being linear, not circular. That is, in eukaryotic cells, there are several long strands of DNA molecules that are always found in the nucleus. The next point refers to ribosomes, very important organelles that produce proteins. As we have already mentioned, all cells have ribosomes. But it turns out that eukaryotic cells have much larger and more complex ribosomes than those found in prokaryotic cells. And pay attention to a small but important point: the ribosomes are not enclosed by their own membrane, not even in eukaryotic cells. It is an organelle without a membrane. Now we come to an interesting difference concerning the metabolism of cells. Recall that we define metabolism as the sum of all the chemical reactions of the organism. In this case, by metabolism we simply refer to the way cells produce energy from food. In all eukaryotic cells, the main metabolic activity is aerobic, meaning it uses oxygen as part of the energy conversion processes. This is why we need to breathe. Oxygen is essential so that we can extract energy from the food we eat. In prokaryotes, the main form of metabolism can be either aerobic or anaerobic, without the use of oxygen. There are many bacteria and archaea that do not need oxygen to produce energy for themselves. By the way, this is one of the reasons why some prokaryotic organisms such as archaea can live in extreme environments, where there simply is no oxygen. They don't depend on it for their survival. Remember these terms: aerobic needing oxygen, and anaerobic without oxygen. And don't worry if you don't understand why oxygen is even necessary for aerobic metabolism, and how it all works. We will learn about this in detail in the next chapter of our biology course. For now, just remember the difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells as listed here. And finally, we see a difference related to the cytoskeleton, which is found in eukaryotes and does not exist in prokaryotes. The cytoskeleton is like a kind of microscopic skeleton of the cell. It helps the cell maintain its shape and internal organization. It also provides mechanical support that allows cells to perform essential functions, such as division and movement. Prokaryotic cells can manage without a cytoskeleton, because their structure is much simpler. In the next part of the lesson, we want to dwell a bit on two very important components of cells. The first organelle we will focus on is the cell nucleus, which of course only exists in eukaryotic cells. Because of its size, the nucleus is one of the most prominent structures in the eukaryotic cell. It is often described as the master control center of the cell, because it contains the genetic information in the form of chromosomes. The purpose of the genetic material, as we have already briefly mentioned, is to provide the cell with instructions on how to build proteins. We will learn in much depth about this process of synthesizing proteins based on genetic information in the cell chapter. Most cells have one nucleus. There are exceptions, but let's ignore them for now. Maybe we can mention one which is quite known. Red blood cells of mammals such as humans have no nucleus at all. But this is really an exception. The nucleus is surrounded by a very selective membrane. Only specific substances can enter or exit the nucleus. Inside, the nucleus is filled with a semi-liquid substance known as nucleoplasm, which is actually quite similar to the cytosol which is found in the cytoplasm. We have a few lessons dedicated to the nucleus and to the different processes that occur inside it, in our next biology chapter about the cell. Recall that this is only an introductory lesson. The second component of the cell on which we would like to dwell a little is called the cell wall. We have already mentioned the cell membrane, which is a layer that surrounds every cell, of any type. But in addition to the membrane, some cells are also surrounded by an even more external covering called the cell wall. Its purpose is to provide the cell with structural support and rigidity, and protect against mechanical load. Note that the cell wall, if present in a certain cell, will be found external to the cell membrane, and not instead of the membrane. Every cell has a membrane, and some have an additional cell wall. So what types of cells have a cell wall? Some types of eukaryotic cells do, for example plant cells like the one shown in the diagram, and fungal cells. And furthermore, all types of prokaryotic cells such as bacterial cells, have cell walls. We will learn about the cell wall structure of the different cell types in future lessons. In the diagram on the right, you can see the cell wall of a plant cell, depicted by the outermost green line, surrounding the cell membrane, which is the dark blue line. In the diagram on the left, we see an animal cell, with a membrane of course, but without a cell wall. This is an important point: animal cells do not have a cell wall. Before we finish the introductory lesson to the cell, we want to mention another theory, called the endosymbiotic theory, which deals with the origin of two special organelles found in eukaryotic cells, called chloroplasts and mitochondria. You can see their structure in the diagrams on the right, but for now we won't go into detail. We have a lesson on both organelles later in the course. Both organelles are related to energy conversion processes in eukaryotic cells. Chloroplasts use solar energy to synthesize, meaning to produce carbohydrates. Chloroplasts are found in plants and green algae, but do not exist in any animal, nor in any fungi. You all have probably heard that plants do photosynthesis. They do so with the help of chloroplasts. Mitochondria, which is the plural form, the singular form is mitochondrion, break down carbohydrates and create a very important molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. Note that mitochondria are present in all eukaryotic cells, including plant, animal, and fungal cells. The production of ATP is of great importance, because ATP serves as the main energy carrier in cells. Think of the ATP molecule as a small battery, which the cell can use to promote different processes, such as synthesizing other molecules, transporting molecules from place to place, or performing special functions, such as muscle contraction or nerve conduction. Without a steady supply of ATP molecules, no cell can survive for long. So every eukaryotic cell has many mitochondria that convert sugars found in the cell into ATP energy molecules. We will learn in detail about how this process is carried out in a future lesson. And why are we even mentioning mitochondria and chloroplasts now? First of all, because they are very important organelles, but also because they are very unusual organelles found in eukaryotic cells. They have several special characteristics that distinguish them from other eukaryotic organelles. In fact, they look almost like a small cell inside the large eukaryotic cell. And this leads us to a theory that offers an interesting explanation for the origin of these organelles. The endosymbiotic theory claims that several organelles in current-day eukaryotic cells were once prokaryotic bacteria. According to this theory, both mitochondria and chloroplasts are the result of the ingestion of ancient bacteria by other ancient larger cells. And that is why they are so different from the rest of the cell and its various organelles. How do we know that this is indeed what happened? After all, it happened over 1 billion years ago. Well, the truth is that we have some pretty convincing evidence for the endosymbiotic theory. First, both chloroplasts and mitochondria are roughly the same size as prokaryotic cells. Remember, prokaryotic cells are significantly smaller than eukaryotic cells. Secondly, chloroplasts and mitochondria divide in a manner similar to that of prokaryotic cells. Inside the cell, these organelles can split into two, similar to how prokaryotic bacteria reproduce by dividing into two. And finally, and most convincingly, both mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA that is separate from the DNA of the cell itself. As we've explained, the genetic material of the eukaryotic cell is found in the nucleus in the form of chromosomes. But in addition, there is some genetic material found in mitochondria and chloroplasts. It is interesting to note that the DNA found in these organelles is circular, just like the shape of the DNA found in prokaryotic cells. The following diagram shows the hypothesis regarding the origin of mitochondria and chloroplasts in eukaryotic cells. The process began when an ancient anaerobic eukaryotic cell engulfed an aerobic prokaryotic cell, called a protobacterium. You don't need to remember this name. Recall that anaerobic metabolism does not use oxygen, while aerobic metabolism does use oxygen. Apparently, this combination of the anaerobic eukaryotic cell and the aerobic prokaryotic protobacterium proved to be evolutionarily successful. Here we see the new aerobic eukaryotic cell, with multiple copies of mitochondria, which evolved from the protobacterium cell. These mitochondria now provide the cell with energy molecules of the ATP type. In a similar process, a photosynthetic bacterium was later absorbed and became the chloroplast of the cell, and this combination was also evolutionarily successful. We now have a cell that can perform photosynthesis, that is, create carbohydrates using solar energy, and then convert these carbohydrates into useful ATP molecules. A true evolutionary winner. We're done with this short introductory lesson on the cell. We will return to the structure of the cell and the processes that take place within it in the next chapter of the course. But before that, we have some lessons on the types of key molecules that we find in living organisms.